Some discoveries change a man's life forever. For tracker Silas Vance, it happened on an autumn morning deep in the Blackwood forest, when the earth beneath his boots revealed a secret that had been buried for 3 decades. He was following a wounded buck through fallen leaves when he found it, a heavy iron hatch hidden under roots and forgotten time, miles from any homestead. What he discovered beneath that rusted lid wasn't a storm shelter. It was something far more dangerous, a forgotten outlaw bunker, stocked with rifles, gold, and plans for a coup that never happened. What would you do if you found 50,000 in gold and enough weapons to start a small war? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning had started like any other October day in the Montana Territory. Silas Vance rose before dawn in his small cabin on the edge of Blackwood Forest, the kind of solitary dwelling that suited a man who preferred the company of trees and deer trails to the noise of town life. At 53 years old, he had settled into a rhythm that felt right, guiding hunters through the wilderness, tracking game for wealthy sportsmen from back east, and living simply on what the forest provided and what his skills could earn. He stood at his wash basin, splashing cold water on his weathered face, studying his reflection in the cloudy mirror. Gray had overtaken most of his dark hair, and the lines around his eyes told stories of decades spent squinting into sun and wind. His hands were scarred and calloused, strong despite his age, still steady enough to handle a rifle or track a deer through terrain that would confuse men half his years. Silas had been a tracker since his youth, learning the craft from his father, who had learned it from his father before him. 3 generations of Vance men had read the forest, like other men read newspapers, understanding the language of bent grass and disturbed soil, the meaning in a broken twig or the spacing of hoofprints in mud. It was honest work, work that connected him to something older than the towns and railroads that were changing the West. His cabin reflected his practical nature. One room served as living space, bedroom, and kitchen. A stone fireplace dominated the north wall, its mantel holding a few treasured possessions, a photograph of his parents, both long dead, a pocket watch that had belonged to his grandfather, and a set of antler sheds from the largest buck he had ever tracked. The furniture was handmade and sturdy, a rope bed with a corn husk mattress, a table and 2 chairs, shelves holding provisions and his few books. Everything had its place, everything served a purpose. He dressed in wool trousers, a heavy flannel shirt, and a leather vest worn smooth by years of use. His boots were good ones, resoled twice but still solid. He strapped on his gun belt, settling the weight of his Colt revolver on his right hip with the familiarity of long habit. The rifle, a Winchester .73, went into the crook of his arm as naturally as breathing. Outside, the forest was awakening. A mist hung low between the pines, and the air carried that particular crispness that comes in late autumn, when summer is a memory and winter waits just beyond the horizon. Silas breathed it in, letting the cold fill his lungs. These were the moments he treasured most. The quiet hours before the world demanded anything of him, when he could simply exist as part of the landscape. He had no clients scheduled for today, which suited him fine. The hunting season had been busy, and he had earned enough to see him through the winter months ahead. Today, he would check his trap line and perhaps take a deer for his own larder. The work was never done, but that was the nature of this life. You provided for yourself, or you did not survive. The town of Millbrook lay 8 miles to the south, a growing settlement that served the ranchers and miners spreading across the territory. Silas visited when necessary, to sell furs, buy supplies, collect payment from the hunters he had guided. He was known there, respected for his skills and his honesty, but he was not part of the community in any real sense. He attended no church socials, joined no civic organizations, courted no widows. His life was here, in the forest, and he preferred it that way. There had been a time when he imagined a different future. He had been engaged once, 30 years ago, to a girl named Sarah Michaels. She was the daughter of Millbrook's general store owner, pretty and kind, with dreams of a proper house and children and a husband who came home every evening. Silas had tried to be that man. He had worked in her father's store, learning the mercantile trade, suffocating slowly behind the counter while the forest called to him through the store's windows. The engagement ended when he could not lie anymore, when he admitted to Sarah that he was not built for town life, that the forest was not just where he worked, but who he was. She had cried, and he still carried the memory of her tears, but she had also understood. She married a banker 2 years later, a good man who gave her the life she wanted. Silas attended the wedding, wished her well, and returned to his cabin with a sense of relief that felt like coming home. He thought of her sometimes, wondered if she ever thought of him. She had 3 grown children now, grandchildren too. Her husband had done well. The life she had wanted, she had received. Silas felt no bitterness about it. Everyone made their choices. He had made his. The trap line took him north into the deeper forest, where the pines grew thick and the undergrowth thinned in the perpetual shade. He moved quietly, automatically noting signs: a fox trail, the scratchings where a bear had marked territory; on a tree trunk, the delicate tracks of a doe and fawn crossing a muddy bank. The forest spoke to him constantly, a running narrative he had learned to interpret without conscious thought. 3 of his 6 traps held game, 2 rabbits and a marten. He reset the traps, added the game to his pack, and continued his circuit. The marten fur would fetch a good price. Rabbit would make a fine stew. These were the practical considerations that governed his days, the simple mathematics of survival and modest prosperity. By mid-morning he had finished the trap line and turned his attention to hunting. He moved deeper into Blackwood Forest, into territory he knew as well as the rooms of his cabin. The deer would be in the lowlands, near the creek that ran through the heart of the forest. The rut was beginning, and the bucks would be careless, driven by instinct older than thought. He found tracks within an hour, a large buck moving purposefully toward the water. The tracks were fresh, still clear in the soft earth. Silas followed them with the patience that defined his craft, never hurrying, reading the story the deer left behind. The buck had paused here to scrape the ground with his hooves, marking territory. He had rubbed his antlers against that pine, leaving scent from the glands on his forehead. He was a mature animal, confident in his domain. The crack of a rifle shot shattered the forest quiet. Silas froze, listening. The shot had come from the east, perhaps a half-mile distant. That was unusual. This section of forest was remote, rarely visited by other hunters. He waited, but no second shot followed. After a moment, he continued tracking the buck, but his mind now worked on 2 problems. Someone else was in these woods. The question was whether they had taken game or missed their shot. He found blood 20 minutes later. The buck's tracks showed a change in stride. Shorter steps, a drag to the right hind leg. Wounded, but not mortally. A poor shot then. The deer would suffer if not found and finished properly. Silas quickened his pace, following the blood trail with growing concern. A wounded animal in pain offended something deep in his nature. The hunter who had made this shot had an obligation to follow through. The blood trail led him southeast, away from his intended path, but in a direction he knew well enough. The buck was heading toward a dense section of forest where fallen timber and thick undergrowth made passage difficult. If the deer went to ground there, finding it would be challenging. Silas moved faster, hoping to catch sight of the animal before it disappeared into that tangle. The forest here was old growth, the kind of timber that predated settlement, massive pines that had stood for centuries. The undergrowth was thick with ferns and berry bushes, and the ground was soft with decades of pine needles and decomposing leaves. It was beautiful country, untouched and wild, the kind of place that reminded a man how small he was in the scheme of things. He paused at the crest of a small rise, scanning the forest below. There, a flash of movement. The buck, moving slowly now, favoring its wounded leg. Silas raised his rifle, found the animal in his sights, and waited for a clear shot. The deer stopped, its head drooping with exhaustion. Silas took a breath, held it, and squeezed the trigger. The shot was clean. The buck dropped without suffering, dead before it hit the ground. Silas lowered his rifle and stood for a moment in silence. He did not enjoy killing, but he understood its necessity. The animal would feed him through part of the winter, and it had died quickly, without prolonged pain. That was the best any hunter could offer. He made his way down the slope toward the fallen deer, already calculating the work ahead. He would need to field dress the animal here, then make a travois to drag it back to his cabin. It would take most of the day, but it was good meat, worth the effort. As he approached the buck, his boot caught on something hard beneath the leaves. He stumbled, caught himself, and looked down at what had tripped him. At first, he thought it was a root, but the texture was wrong. Too smooth, too regular. He knelt and brushed away the leaves. Iron. A curved edge of heavy iron, rusted but solid. He cleared more debris, following the curve, and his breath caught in his throat. It was not a root, it was a hatch. A large industrial iron hatch, set flush with the ground and hidden beneath decades of forest debris. Silas sat back on his heels, staring at the impossible thing before him. A hatch. Here. 20 miles from the nearest homestead, in forest so remote that few men ever set foot in it. The iron was old, the rust deep, but the construction was solid, purposeful. This was not some forgotten root cellar or abandoned mine shaft. This was something built to last, built to be hidden. He glanced at the dead buck, then back at the hatch. The deer could wait a few minutes. He had to know what this was. His fingers found the edge of the hatch, testing its weight. Heavy, very heavy. He worked his knife blade under the edge, prying gently, and felt the hatch shift slightly. It was not locked, just rusted shut by time and neglect. Silas pulled harder, throwing his weight into the effort. The hatch groaned, metal scraping against metal, and suddenly broke free. He pulled it open, the hinges screaming in protest, and stared down into darkness. A ladder descended into the void. Iron rungs, solid despite the rust. The smell that rose from below was stale air and old stone, the scent of a place sealed off from the world for a very long time. Silas leaned over the opening, peering into the shadows, and felt his heart begin to hammer in his chest. This was not a storm shelter. Storm shelters were not built in the middle of remote forest. They were built near homes, near towns, places where people gathered when the weather turned violent. This was something else entirely. Something hidden deliberately. Something that had been waiting in the dark for him to find it. He should cover the hatch, he knew. He should tend to the deer, return to his cabin, and forget he had seen this thing. Whatever lay below was none of his business, a relic of someone else's secrets. But even as the thought formed, he knew he would not heed it. Curiosity was a powerful force, and this mystery pulled at him with an intensity he could not explain or resist. Silas secured his rifle across his back and gripped the top rung of the ladder. The iron was cold beneath his hands, solid despite its age. He tested his weight on the first rung, then the second. They held. He began to descend into the darkness, leaving the forest light behind, climbing down into secrets that had been buried for longer than he could guess. The hatch remained open above him, a square of gray sky growing smaller with each step downward, until finally his boots found solid ground, and he stood in the cool darkness of whatever this place had been built to hide. Silas stood in complete darkness, waiting for his eyes to adjust. The air was cool and dry. carrying that peculiar stillness of enclosed spaces that have been sealed for years. He could hear his own breathing, loud in the silence, and the faint drip of water somewhere in the distance. Slowly, shapes began to emerge from the black, the suggestion of walls, the bulk of objects he could not yet identify. He fumbled for the matches in his vest pocket, struck one against the rough stone wall. The flame flared bright, momentarily blinding, then settled into a steady glow. In its light, he saw he was standing in a small antechamber, perhaps 10 feet square, with walls of poured concrete reinforced with iron bars. The construction was professional, military in its precision. This was no amateur excavation. On the wall to his right, mounted in an iron bracket, was an oil lamp. Silas lifted it down, shook it gently, oil sloshed inside, and lit the wick. Golden light flooded the space, revealing details the match flame had only hinted at. The floor was concrete, smooth and level. The walls showed no signs of water damage or deterioration. Whoever had built this place had built it to endure. A doorway led deeper into the structure. Silas moved toward it, holding the lamp high. The passage beyond was narrow, carved through solid rock and reinforced with timber supports every few feet. His boots echoed on the stone floor. The passage ran straight for perhaps 20 feet, then opened into a larger chamber. What he saw there stopped him in his tracks. The chamber was vast, easily 40 feet across and half again as deep. The ceiling was high, supported by massive timber beams that showed no sign of rot or weakness. But it was not the construction that froze Silas where he stood. It was the contents. Shelves lined every wall, floor to ceiling, packed with supplies. He moved closer, holding the lamp to read the labels. Preserved. Food. Beans, rice, hardtack, tinned meat, vegetables in jars, enough to feed a dozen men for months, medical supplies in neat wooden crates, blankets, wool clothing, boots still wrapped in oiled paper, water barrels full by their weight, rope, tools, hardware. Everything a group of men would need to survive underground for an extended period. But that was not what made his hands begin to tremble. Against the far wall stood wooden crates stacked 6 high and 20 across. Silas set the lamp down and approached them slowly, already knowing what he would find, but needing to see it confirmed. He pried open the nearest crate with his knife. Inside, packed in grease and straw, were rifles. Brand new Winchester rifles, their metal gleaming even in the lamplight. He checked another crate. More rifles. And another. All rifles, all new, all perfectly preserved. He stepped back, trying to count the crates. 60, perhaps 70. If each contained even a dozen rifles. His mind struggled with the mathematics. This was not a collection. This was an arsenal. This was enough firepower to equip a small army. A table stood in the center of the chamber, and Silas moved toward it with the growing sense that he was trespassing in a place that had been meant to stay hidden forever. On the table were papers, maps, ledgers, all carefully arranged and covered with a sheet of oilcloth to protect them from moisture. He lifted the cloth gently, as though the papers might crumble at his touch. The top document was a map of Montana Territory, but unlike any map he had ever seen. It showed not towns and roads, but tunnels, an elaborate network of passages running beneath the capital city and connecting to strategic points throughout the region. Red marks indicated buildings, with notes in careful handwriting. Governor's Mansion, 3 guards night watch. Armory, basement access via Tunnel 7. Telegraph office, vulnerable from below. Silas felt his chest tighten. This was not a map. This was a battle plan. He shuffled through the other papers with growing dread. Ledgers listing names, hundreds of them, organized by town and county. Next to each name was a notation: sympathizer, recruit, paid, unreliable. He recognized some of the names. Men from Mill Brook, men from neighboring towns. Some were prominent citizens. Others were drifters and troublemakers. What united them was their presence on this list. Another document bore the heading Iron League Articles of Foundation. Silas read the opening paragraph and felt the hair on the back of his neck stand up. It was a manifesto, flowery and grand in its language, but the message was clear. The territorial government was corrupt and illegitimate, and it was the duty of righteous men to overthrow it by force and establish a new order based on, the document became vague here, traditional values and natural law. Revolution. This was a revolutionary plot, or had been. He found a calendar, carefully marked with dates and annotations. The most recent entry was dated September 12, 1843, 31 years ago. The note read, "Final preparations complete. Action commences October 1st. God grant us victory and a new dawn." 31 years. Silas lowered himself into the chair, his legs suddenly unsteady. Whatever had been planned here, it had been abandoned before it could be executed. The question was why. What had happened to stop men who had gone to such extraordinary lengths to prepare? He continued searching the table, driven now by a need to understand. A leather journal lay beneath the maps, and he opened it to the first page. The handwriting was neat and educated, the ink still dark. This journal is the record of the Iron League, founded in the year 1841 by men of conscience and courage who could no longer stand idle while corruption and tyranny took root in our territory. We are merchants and ranchers, miners and professionals, united by the conviction that the current government serves only the interests of Eastern money and gives no voice to those who have built this land with their sweat and blood. The entries continued for pages, detailing the growth of the organization, the recruitment of members, the planning of the coup. The author, a man named Ezekiel Stone, apparently the leader, wrote with the fervor of a true believer. He described the construction of this bunker, the acquisition of weapons, the mapping of tunnels beneath the capital. Every detail was recorded, every preparation noted. Then, abruptly, the entries changed tone. August 1843. Word has reached us that the territorial marshal suspects our existence. We must accelerate our timeline. September 1843. 3 of our members have been arrested on false charges. The net is closing. We move forward as planned, but I fear we have been compromised. The final entry, dated September 28, 1843, was brief and chilling. They know federal troops arrive today. If we do not act now, all will be lost. We ride tonight for the capital. God willing, this journal will become a testament to victory. If not, if you are reading this and we have failed, know that we tried to build something better than what we found. That was the last entry. The rest of the pages were blank. Silas closed the journal and sat in the silence of the bunker. His mind raced, trying to piece together what must have happened. The Iron League had planned their coup, but somehow word had leaked. Federal troops had intervened. And then, what? A battle? A massacre? He had never heard of any of this, but 30 years ago he had been a boy, living on a farm far from the capital. News traveled slowly in those days. A failed revolutionary plot might have been suppressed, buried in official silence to avoid encouraging other would-be rebels. He rose and walked the perimeter of the chamber, taking inventory. The rifles alone represented a fortune. The preserved food and supplies had value. But it was what he found in the final corner that made him stop breathing. 3 large strong boxes secured with heavy locks. Silas used his knife to pry open the first. Inside, wrapped in oiled cloth, were gold coins, double eagles, freshly minted in 1843, gleaming in the lamplight. He opened the second box. More gold. And the third. All told, he estimated there was perhaps $50,000 in gold sitting in those boxes, untouched for 3 decades. Silas sank down beside the strong boxes, his heart pounding. This was not just a historical curiosity. This was wealth beyond anything he had ever imagined possessing. This could change everything about his life, if he chose to claim it. But claiming it meant questions he might not want to answer. Where did you get this gold, Silas? How did you find it? What else was in that place you discovered? He thought of the maps, the names in the ledgers, the evidence of conspiracy that filled this chamber. Possessing this gold might connect him to treason, to revolution, to crimes that might have no statute of limitations. And yet, the men who had planned this had been dead for 30 years. Who would even care anymore? But someone might. Someone might care very much. As Silas sat in the golden lamplight, surrounded by the ghosts of failed revolution, he understood that his life had just become infinitely more complicated. The simple choice before him, claim the gold or walk away, was actually no choice at all. The moment he had opened that hatch, the moment he had descended into this buried secret, he had set events in motion that could not be undone. He needed time to think, time to decide. But first, he needed to get out of this place and back into the clean air and sunlight of the world above. He stood, took one last look around the chamber, and began walking back toward the passage that led to the surface. Behind him, the lamp flickered and dimmed. Ahead, the promise of daylight drew him forward, but the weight of what he had discovered pressed down on his shoulders like a physical burden, and he knew with absolute certainty that his life would never be as simple as it had been that morning. Silas emerged from the bunker into afternoon sunlight that seemed harsh after the darkness below. He pulled himself up through the hatch, breathing hard, and stood for a moment, letting his eyes adjust. The forest was exactly as he had left it. The dead buck lying where it had fallen, the trees standing silent witness, the ordinary world continuing its ordinary rhythms. But everything felt different now. He felt different, as though he had crossed an invisible threshold and could not return to who he had been that morning. He lowered the hatch carefully, noting its position so he could find it again. Then he covered it with leaves and debris, restoring the forest floor to its natural appearance. His hands moved automatically through the work, but his mind was elsewhere, turning over the implications of what he had found. $50,000 in gold. That number kept circling through his thoughts like a hawk over prey. It was more money than he would earn in a dozen lifetimes of tracking and guiding. It was enough to buy land, build a proper ranch, live comfortably for the rest of his days. It was security, freedom, the kind of cushion against hardship that few men ever achieved. But it was also blood money in a sense. It had been gathered to finance treason, to arm men who planned to overthrow their government. The fact that the coup had failed did not change what the gold had been intended for, and somewhere, in some dusty federal archive, there might be records of that gold, of the Iron League, of their conspiracy. Taking it might draw attention he did not want. He field-dressed the buck methodically, his hands performing the familiar work while his thoughts continued their troubled circling. The deer's meat was good, the animal fat and healthy. Waste was not in Silas's nature. Whatever complications his discovery had introduced into his life, this deer still needed to be processed and the meat preserved. He fashioned a travois from pine branches and rope, loaded the dressed carcass onto it, and began the long walk back to his cabin. The weight pulled at his shoulders, and sweat soaked through his shirt despite the cool air. The physical labor was welcome, a distraction from the questions that had no easy answers. By the time he reached his cabin, dusk was settling over the forest. He hung the deer in his smokehouse, built a fire to begin the smoking process, and finally allowed himself to rest. His body ached from the day's exertions, but his mind would not quiet. He sat on his porch as darkness came, smoking his pipe, staring into the forest shadows. What would a sensible man do? The sensible thing would be to forget the bunker, go about his life, and let the past stay buried. But Silas was honest enough to admit that he was not going to do the sensible thing. That gold represented possibilities he had never allowed himself to imagine. He was 53 years old, still strong and capable, but age was coming for him as it came for every man. How many more years could he live this hard life before his body gave out? How many winters could he face alone before loneliness became something he could not bear? He thought of Sarah Michaels, now Sarah Brennan, living her comfortable life in town. She had made the practical choice, married the practical man. She had security, family, a place in the community. Silas had chosen differently, and he had never regretted it until now. But now, holding the knowledge of that gold in his mind, he wondered what different choices might have meant. Sleep did not come easily that night. He lay in his bed, listening to the night sounds of the forest, and when he finally drifted off, his dreams were troubled by images of darkness and underground chambers and gold coins that burned his hands when he tried to hold them. Morning brought no clarity, only the same questions circling like wolves. Silas rose, tended to his fire, checked the deer in the smokehouse. He made coffee and cornbread for breakfast, forcing himself to eat though he had little appetite. The routines of his life felt hollow now, as though he was going through motions that no longer had meaning. He needed advice, but there was no one he trusted enough to share this secret. The men he knew in Millbrook were acquaintances, not friends. He had lived too long apart from the community to have formed the kind of bonds that allowed for this level of confidence. The isolation he had chosen now felt like a trap. By mid-morning, he had made a decision. He would return to the bunker. He would examine everything more carefully, take proper inventory, and look for any clue about what had happened to the Iron League. Knowledge was power, his father had always said. The more he understood about this situation, the better equipped he would be to decide what to do about it. He packed supplies, rope, more lamp oil, canvas bags, a notebook, and pencil. If he was going to catalogue what was down there, he would do it properly. He checked his rifle, strapped on his gun belt, and set out for the bunker with the sun climbing toward noon. The walk took less time than he remembered. Perhaps because he knew where he was going now, or perhaps because his mind was so occupied that the distance passed without notice. He found the hatch without difficulty, cleared the debris he had arranged over it the day before, and pulled it open. The descent into darkness felt less frightening this time. He knew what waited below, but as his boots touched the floor of the antechamber and he lit the oil lamp, a new thought struck him with uncomfortable force. What if he was not the first person to rediscover this place? What if others had found it over the years, taken what they wanted, and left no trace? The bunker's contents had seemed undisturbed, but he was no expert in such things. He moved through the passage into the main chamber and immediately felt relieved. Everything was as he had left it. The strong boxes still sat in their corner, the rifles still packed in their crates, the maps and papers still spread on the table. If anyone else had found this place, they had not touched its contents. Silas set to work with methodical precision. He opened every crate, counted every rifle. 72 in total, each a Winchester model 1873, each pristine and ready to use. He inventoried the preserved food, enough for perhaps 20 men for 6 months. He examined the medical supplies, the tools, the clothing. Everything was carefully organized, everything of high quality. Then he turned his attention to the papers. He read through the journal more carefully this time, noting names and dates. He studied the maps, tracing the tunnels that had been planned beneath the capital. Some appeared to have been completed. The notations indicated functional or verified access. Others were marked as proposed or unfinished. The scope of the planning was breathtaking. These men had devoted years to their conspiracy. One name appeared repeatedly throughout the documents: Ezekiel Stone, the journal's author. He was clearly the leader, the driving force behind the Iron League. Silas found a description of him in one of the ledgers. Ezekiel Stone, age 38, merchant of Helena, educated Boston College, Married, 2 daughters, passionate speaker, natural leader, convinced of the righteousness of our cause. A merchant with a family, educated and prosperous, driven to treason by conviction. What had become of him? Had he died in the confrontation with federal troops? Been imprisoned? Fled the territory? The journal's final entry suggested they had ridden to face their enemies, but it gave no indication of the outcome. Silas found himself respecting these men despite the nature of their conspiracy. They had been wrong, certainly. Revolution was not the answer to political disagreement, but they had been sincere in their beliefs, committed enough to risk everything. That took courage, however misguided. He spent hours in the bunker, reading and cataloging, and when he finally emerged into the late afternoon light, his mind was full of the Iron League's story, but he was no closer to deciding what to do about the gold. The weight of that decision pressed on him as he covered the hatch once more and began the walk back to his cabin. Tomorrow, he told himself. Tomorrow he would decide. But even as he thought it, he knew he was only delaying the inevitable. Some choices make themselves. Regardless of what we tell ourselves, we will do. 3 days passed before Silas returned to Millbrook. He told himself he needed supplies, that his stores were running low, but the truth was more complicated. He needed to be among people, to hear ordinary conversation, to remind himself of the normal world that existed beyond his discovery. The bunker and its secrets had begun to feel like the only real thing in his life, and that frightened him. The town was busy when he arrived, wagons crowding the main street, people moving between shops with the purposeful energy of a community preparing for winter. Silas tied his horse outside the general store and stepped into its familiar warmth. The smell of coffee and dry goods, the creak of floorboards, the sound of Sarah Brennan's voice as she helped a customer. All of it felt both comforting and strange, as though he was seeing a place he had visited in childhood rather than a place he had been just 2 weeks before. Silas Vance. Sarah's voice pulled him from his thoughts. She approached with the easy smile of long familiarity, her hair gray now, but her eyes still sharp and kind. "We don't see you often these days. Running low on coffee again?" Among other things, he handed her his list, carefully written that morning. Sugar, flour, coffee, salt, ammunition, the usual necessities, nothing that would draw attention or questions. She read the list, her lips moving slightly. "I can have this ready in 20 minutes. Bill's in the back if you want to say hello." Bill Brennan was her husband, the banker she had married instead of Silas. They had settled into a comfortable acquaintanceship over the years, helped by the fact that Bill was a decent man with no obvious flaws to resent. Silas found him in the storeroom, checking inventory against a ledger. "Silas?" Bill extended his hand, his grip firm. "Good to see you. How's the season been?" "Good enough." Silas settled against a barrel of flour. "Took a nice buck a few days back. Been smoking the meat." "That's fine. We'll be getting our winter provisions soon." Bill returned to his ledger, making small marks with a pencil. "You hear about the territory appointment? New territorial secretary coming in from Washington." "Can't say I have." "Fellow named Morrison, supposed to arrive next month. Everyone's curious to meet him." Bill looked up from his ledger. "You thinking of staying out at the cabin all winter, or might you come to town more often this year?" It was a kind question, the sort that friends ask when they worry. Silas considered it carefully. "Depends on how the weather runs." "Why do you ask?" "No particular reason, just that you're not getting any younger, and winters can be hard on a man alone." Bill's tone was carefully neutral. "There's a room above the hardware store. Old Tom Wilson used to rent it. Still available if you ever wanted a place in town for the worst months. I'll keep that in mind." The conversation drifted to safer topics. Weather predictions, the price of furs, news from the railroad camps to the east. Ordinary talk, the kind that filled the spaces between people who knew each other, but were not truly close. Silas found it soothing, a reminder that life continued its normal patterns, regardless of what secrets lay buried in the forest. When his supplies were packed, Silas paid with coins from his leather purse and loaded the goods onto his horse. Sarah walked him to the door, her hand briefly touching his arm. "You take care of yourself out there, Silas. Winter's coming early this year. I can feel it in my bones." "I'll be fine. I always am." "I know." Her smile was sad somehow, touched with old regrets. "But that doesn't mean I don't worry." He rode out of town with her words following him, and for the first time in years, he wondered what his life might have been like if he had chosen differently that day so long ago. Would he be the one standing behind the counter of the general store, measuring out flour and making small talk? Would he have children, grandchildren, a place in the community that felt solid and real? But he knew the answer. That life would have suffocated him. He was not built for it, any more than a wolf was built for a barnyard. The forest was his home, and he had no regrets about the choice he had made. He had regrets about other things, words unsaid, chances not taken, the ways he had let himself become isolated, but not about choosing the forest over the town. The ride back to his cabin gave him time to think, and by the time he arrived at dusk, he had reached a decision. He would take the gold. Not all of it, not at first, but enough to test whether anyone cared about it after 30 years. A few coins, nothing that would draw attention. He would take them to the assayer in Helena, claim he had found them while tracking, and see what questions were asked. If no alarm was raised, if no authorities came asking about Iron League gold, then he would know the past was truly buried. And if questions did arise, well, he would deal with that when it happened. But doing nothing, leaving that gold to sit in the darkness for another 30 years, felt like cowardice now. Whatever risks came with claiming it, at least they were risks he chose to take. That night, lying in his bed, Silas allowed himself to imagine what he might do with real wealth. Not grand things. He was too practical for fantasies of mansions and servants, but small improvements that would make his life easier. A better rifle, quality tools. Perhaps he would build a larger cabin, something with a real kitchen and a room for guests he never had. Maybe he would travel, see some of the country beyond Montana. He had lived his entire life within 100 miles of where he was born. There was a whole continent out there he had never seen. Sleep came easier that night. The decision made. Tomorrow he would return to the bunker. He would select a few gold coins, enough to have them assayed, but not enough to draw suspicion. He would be careful, methodical, patient. If this was going to work, he needed to do it right. But as he drifted off, a small voice in the back of his mind whispered a warning he chose not to hear. The gold had been hidden for a reason. Men had died for it, or because of it. Secrets that dangerous did not stay buried simply because time had passed. They waited, patient as stone, for someone to disturb them. And once disturbed, they had a way of pulling a man down into darkness he had not anticipated. Silas slept and dreamed of gold coins that burned like hot coals in his hands, and woke in the hour before dawn with his heart racing and sweat cooling on his skin. Outside, the forest was silent, waiting for whatever would come next. Inside, Silas lay very still, wondering if he was making the worst mistake of his life. But morning would come regardless, and with it, the commitment he had made to himself. There was no turning back now. The path ahead was set, for better or for worse. Silas stood at the edge of the bunker hatch, a canvas bag in his hand, and allowed himself one final moment of doubt. Once he took the gold, everything changed. Until this moment, he could still claim he had simply found an old bunker, looked around out of curiosity, and left it undisturbed. But taking the gold made him a thief, regardless of how he justified it. The men who had gathered that fortune were long dead, true, but the gold itself belonged to whom? The government they had planned to overthrow? The families of the conspirators? No one. He pulled open the hatch and descended. The lamp oil he had brought the day before still sat where he had left it, and he lit the wick with steady hands. The golden light filled the antechamber, and he moved through the familiar passage into the main chamber. Everything was as he remembered. The rifles in their crates, the supplies on their shelves, the strong boxes in their corner. Silas knelt beside the first strong box and opened it carefully. The gold coins gleamed in the lamplight, row upon row of double eagles, each bearing the date 1843. He selected 5 coins, holding them in his palm, feeling their weight. $250, based on face value. Probably worth more to a collector, given their age and condition, enough to test the waters without drawing too much attention. He wrapped the coins in cloth, placed them in his bag, and closed the strong box. Then he stood and looked around the chamber one more time. There was so much here, so much value beyond just the gold. The rifles alone represented thousands of dollars. The historical documents, if they could be sold to a museum or university, might be worth even more. But moving any of that would require help, would require trust, and Silas was not ready for that level of complication. The gold was different. 5 coins could be explained. A lucky find while tracking. An old cache buried by someone long forgotten. Nothing that would inspire detailed investigation, he hoped. Back at his cabin, Silas hid the coins in a compartment he carved into the underside of his table, a space invisible unless you knew where to look. Then he went about his normal routines, checking his trap line, tending to his smokehouse, chopping wood for the coming winter. The physical work helped settle his nerves, but he could not quite shake the feeling that he had crossed a line he could not uncross. 2 days later, he rode to Helena. The territorial capital was 2 days' ride from his cabin, a growing city that served as the center of government and commerce for the region. He had been there only a handful of times over the years, always for business, never lingering longer than necessary. Cities made him uncomfortable. Too many people pressed too close together, too much noise and bustle. The assayer's office was on Main Street, a small building wedged between a haberdashery and a law office. Silas tied his horse and stepped inside, his hand unconsciously checking for the cloth-wrapped coins in his vest pocket. The interior was dim and cluttered, shelves lined with mineral samples and equipment whose purpose he could only guess. Behind a scarred wooden desk sat a man in his 40s, bald and wearing spectacles, his shirt sleeves rolled up to reveal arms marked with old burn scars. "Help you?" The man did not look up from the ledger he was studying. "Need some coins assayed." Silas placed the cloth bundle on the desk. That got the man's attention. He set down his pencil and unwrapped the coins carefully, his expression shifting from bored indifference to sharp interest. "Where did you get these?" "Found them while tracking." Silas kept his voice level, his story prepared. "Old cache buried in the forest. Figured they might be worth something beyond face value." The assayer picked up one coin, examined it closely under a magnifying glass, then tested it with a small file and a vial of acid. Silas watched, his heart beating faster than he would have liked. The assayer repeated the process with each coin, methodical and thorough. "They're genuine," the man said finally. 1843 double eagles, excellent condition, worth more to a collector than their face value. I can give you $300 for all 5. 300. Silas kept his face neutral. That was $50 more than face value, a tidy profit. That seems fair. Where exactly did you find these? The assayer was studying him now, his eyes shrewd behind his spectacles. Near the Blackwood Forest, old hollow tree, looked like someone cached them there years ago and never came back. Interesting. The man made a note in his ledger. You find anything else? Any more coins? Any documents? Just these 5. Silas met the man's gaze steadily. Why do you ask? No reason. Just that coins from 1843 are relatively rare. They represent a specific period in the territory's history. Some historians might be interested in the context of the find. I'm a tracker, not a historian. I'm interested in the value, not the history. The assayer smiled thinly. Of course, $300 then. I'll need your name for the ledger. Silas provided it, watching as the man wrote carefully, Silas Vance, tracker, Blackwood Forest region, 5/1843 double eagles, found cached in wilderness. The notation felt dangerous somehow, a record that connected him to the gold, but refusing to provide his name would have been more suspicious than complying. The assayer counted out $300 in mixed bills and coin, and Silas pocketed it with a nod of thanks. As he turned to leave, the assayer spoke again. If you find more coins like these, bring them to me. I can always offer fair value. I'll keep that in mind. Outside, the afternoon sun was bright and the street was crowded with afternoon traffic. Silas untied his horse and rode slowly through town, his mind working. The assayer had been interested, perhaps too interested. His questions about the find's location, about whether there were more coins, suggested he knew something about the history of that gold. Or perhaps Silas was being paranoid, seeing suspicion where there was only professional curiosity. He spent the night at a boarding house on the edge of town, a clean room that cost him 50 cents and came with a simple dinner. The landlady was a widow in her 60s, friendly but not intrusive, and the other boarders were laborers and miners who kept to themselves. Silas ate in silence, went to his room early, and lay awake for hours listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the city. The money from the coins sat in his pocket, tangible proof that his plan could work. But it also represented a commitment. He had taken the first step. There would be more steps now, each one potentially more dangerous than the last. Sleep, when it finally came, brought dreams of underground chambers and men in the shadows asking questions he could not answer. Morning found him saddling his horse before dawn, eager to be away from the city and back in the familiar embrace of the forest. The ride home took all day, and by the time he reached his cabin, the sun was setting and he was exhausted. But the $300 was still in his pocket, and the assayer's questions had not led to any immediate problems. He had done it. He had converted part of the Iron League's gold into usable money without raising any obvious alarms. The question now was what to do next. Take more gold. Wait and see if questions arose. The prudent thing would be to wait, to let time pass, to ensure that his first transaction had not triggered any investigation. But prudence had never been Silas's strongest quality. He had spent his entire life taking calculated risks, tracking dangerous animals, guiding hunters through treacherous terrain, living alone in wilderness that could kill a careless man. This was just another risk, just another calculation, and the potential reward was too significant to ignore. That night, he sat on his porch and counted the money by lantern light. $300. It was more cash than he typically saw in 6 months of work, and it represented only 5 coins out of thousands sitting in that bunker. The mathematics were compelling. If he was careful, if he spread the transactions over time and used different assayers in different towns, he could convert that gold into a fortune without drawing undue attention. The wind rustled through the pines, and somewhere in the distance a wolf howled. Silas listened to the familiar sounds of his forest home and made his decision. He would wait a month, give time for any questions about the first coins to surface. If nothing happened, he would take more gold to a different assayer in a different town. Slow and steady, patient and careful. That was how you tracked dangerous game, and that was how you converted buried treasure into a new life. The future suddenly seemed full of possibilities that had not existed a week ago. And if there was danger in those possibilities, well, danger was something Silas understood. He had lived with it all his life. This was just a different kind of wilderness, but the principles were the same. Stay alert, move carefully, and trust your instincts. That had kept him alive for 53 years. It would have to be enough. The month passed with agonizing slowness. Silas went about his usual business, checking traps, guiding a wealthy merchant from St. Louis on a hunting expedition, preparing his cabin for winter. But beneath the surface of his normal life, tension coiled like a spring. Every time he went to Millbrook for supplies, he expected to be questioned. Every stranger who appeared in the forest felt like a threat. The waiting was worse than action would have been. No questions came, no federal marshals appeared at his door, no curious officials arrived asking about found gold coins. The world continued its indifferent rotation, and slowly Silas began to believe he might actually succeed in this venture. The Isaiah and Helena had accepted his story, recorded the transaction, and apparently thought nothing more of it. The gold coins had simply been old coins, interesting but not suspicious. By late November, snow had begun to dust the higher elevations, and Silas made his second trip. This time he rode south to Bannock, a mining town 3 days from his cabin. The assayer there was a younger man, energetic and talkative, who barely glanced at Silas before testing the coins. 10 this time, and offering $650 without a single question beyond the routine notation of name and date. Silas rode home through the first real snowfall of winter, with nearly $1,000 in his pockets and a growing confidence that this was going to work. The Iron League's gold was his now, in every practical sense. Dead men had no claim to wealth, and 30 years was long enough for any crime to be forgotten. But confidence, he would learn, was a dangerous thing. The first hint of trouble came in early December. Silas had ridden to Millbrook for supplies when he noticed a stranger in the general store, a well-dressed man in his 30s with the bearing of someone accustomed to authority. He was questioning Sarah Brennan about local trappers and guides, asking specifically about anyone who might have been exploring the Blackwood Forest region. Silas kept his face neutral and busied himself examining a display of traps, but his ears were attuned to every word. Sarah mentioned several names, men who hunted and trapped in the area, and then, almost as an afterthought, mentioned Silas. Silas Vance lives out that way. Been a tracker all his life, knows that forest better than anyone in the territory. The stranger made a note in a small leather journal. This Silas Vance. Where might I find him? He has a cabin on the western edge of Blackwood, but he's not always there. Spends a lot of time in the woods. Sarah's tone was cautious now, protective. May I ask what this is about? Just routine inquiries. I'm with the Territorial Land Office, surveying potential parcels for future development. The stranger smiled, but it did not reach his eyes. Nothing to concern yourself with, ma'am. Silas waited until the stranger left before approaching the counter. Sarah was frowning, her fingers drumming on the wooden surface in a gesture he recognized from their youth. It meant she was worried. That man was no land surveyor, she said quietly. I've met land surveyors. They don't ask about specific people. They ask about terrain and water rights. What do you think he was? I don't know, but I don't trust him. She looked at Silas directly. Are you in some kind of trouble? Not that I know of. The lie came easily, but he saw skepticism in her eyes. I'll be careful. See that you are. Silas left town immediately, his mind racing. A stranger asking questions about people who knew Blackwood Forest. It could be coincidence, or it could be connected to the gold. But how? He had been careful, used different assayers, never taken too much at once. Unless, the thought stopped him cold. Unless the assayers had been comparing notes, had noticed a pattern of old gold coins appearing from the same general region. Back at his cabin, he sat up late into the night, trying to decide on a course of action. He could stop taking the gold, let the matter rest, but he had already converted perhaps $2,000 worth, a fraction of what was available. Stopping now felt like leaving the game when he was ahead but could win so much more. Or he could accelerate, take a larger quantity of gold, convert it quickly through multiple assayers across several towns, and then disappear for a while. Let any investigation run cold. It was riskier, but it would give him more resources to work with. The third option was to confront the situation directly. Find out who the stranger was, what he wanted, what he knew. But that risked revealing information Silas wanted to keep hidden. He decided to wait and watch. If the stranger came to his cabin, Silas would be ready with a plausible story. If federal marshals appeared, he would claim he had found a few old coins and sold them, knowing nothing of their significance. The bunker would remain his secret unless he had no other choice. 3 days later, the stranger appeared. Silas was splitting firewood when he saw the rider approaching through the snow-dusted forest. He set down his axe and waited, his hand resting casually on the revolver at his hip. The stranger dismounted and approached with a smile that looked practiced. "Mr. Vance, I'm Thomas Gardner with the Territorial Land Office. I wonder if I might have a moment of your time." "About what?" "I understand you're quite familiar with the Blackwood Forest region. I'm conducting a survey of the area and could use some local expertise." Gardner's eyes were sharp, cataloging details. The cabin, the smokehouse, Silas himself. "I know the forest." "What specifically are you surveying?" "Underground. Water resources, primarily. Cave systems, natural wells, that sort of thing." Gardner pulled out his leather journal. "Have you ever come across any underground structures in your travels? Storm cellars, old mine workings, anything of that nature?" The question hung in the cold air between them. Silas kept his face carefully neutral, years of poker games with hunters serving him well. "Can't say I have. The Blackwood is old forest. Not much human development out that way." "No abandoned homesteads? No signs of previous habitation?" "Nothing recent. Some old wagon ruts from the early days, but they're mostly grown over." Silas met Gardner's gaze steadily. "This is about water resources?" "Among other things." Gardner closed his journal. "The territory is growing, Mr. Vance. We need to understand what resources are available in undeveloped regions. Your knowledge could be quite valuable to us." "I'm just a tracker. I follow game, guide hunters. I'm not much for surveying work." "Still, if you should come across anything interesting, any underground structures, any unusual features, the Territorial Office would appreciate being informed. There could be compensation for useful information." "I'll keep that in mind." Gardner mounted his horse, but paused before leaving. "One more thing, Mr. Vance. Have you had occasion to do business with any assayers recently? Sold any found items? Perhaps old coins or the like?" There it was, the real question beneath all the others. Silas felt his pulse quicken but kept his voice level. "I found some old coins while tracking. Sold them for their metal value." "That a problem?" "Not at all. Just curious about their origin. Old coins can tell us a lot about territorial history. They were just coins in a tree hollow. No story to them that I know of." Gardner nodded slowly, his eyes never leaving Silas's face. "Of course. Well, thank you for your time, Mr. Vance. I'm sure we'll speak again." He rode away, and Silas watched until he disappeared into the trees. Then he went inside his cabin, bolted the door, and sat down to think. Gardner was no land surveyor. He was an investigator of some kind, and he knew about the gold. Whether he knew about the bunker was unclear, but he was asking the right questions to find out. Silas had a decision to make, and he had to make it quickly. Continue with his plan and risk further investigation, or stop now and hope Gardner lost interest. The safe choice was obvious. But sitting in his cabin with winter closing in and a fortune still buried in the forest, safety felt like cowardice. He thought about Ezekiel Stone and the Iron League, men who had risked everything for what they believed in. They had failed, but at least they had tried. Silas was no revolutionary, but he understood the impulse to reach for something more than the hand you had been dealt. The question was whether he was willing to pay the price that reaching might demand. Outside, snow began to fall. In earnest, the first real storm of winter. Inside, Silas sat by his fire and contemplated the mathematics of risk and reward, knowing that whatever he decided in the next few hours would determine the shape of everything that followed. The gold was there. The danger was real, and time, patient and implacable, was running out. The storm lasted 3 days, pinning Silas in his cabin with nothing but his thoughts and the howling wind for company. He used the time to plan, sketching out scenarios and contingencies in the margins of an old newspaper. If Gardner was investigating the gold, there were only a few ways he could have made the connection. The assayers must have reported the transactions, whether routinely or because someone had specifically asked them to watch for old coins. Silas could not know. But there was another possibility that troubled him more. What if someone else knew about the bunker? What if the Iron League's conspiracy had not been as forgotten as he assumed? Gardner's questions about underground structures suggested he was looking for something specific, not just investigating random coin sales. On the 4th day, the storm broke. Silas woke to crystalline silence and a world transformed by snow. The forest was beautiful and deadly, the kind of landscape that would kill a careless traveler in hours. He dressed warmly, strapped on snowshoes, and set out for the bunker. He needed to know if Gardner or anyone else had found it. The journey took twice as long as usual, breaking trail through knee-deep snow. By the time he reached the area where the bunker lay hidden, the sun was high and weak, offering light but no warmth. Silas approached carefully, watching for tracks, for any sign of disturbance. The snow was pristine, unmarked by human passage. The hatch remained hidden beneath its covering of leaves, now also buried under snow, exactly as he had left it. He cleared the snow and debris, opened the hatch, and descended. The lamp oil was where he had stored it, and he lit the wick with hands stiff from cold. The bunker was unchanged, the gold still secure in its strong boxes, the rifles still packed in their crates. Relief washed over him. Whatever Gardner knew or suspected, he had not found the bunker itself. Silas was about to leave when his eye caught something he had not noticed in his previous visits. In the far corner of the chamber, partially hidden behind a stack of supply crates, was a second door. It was small, easily missed, and secured with a heavy iron bolt. He had assumed the chamber ended at the walls, but apparently there was more to this structure than he had realized. He approached the door, curiosity overcoming caution. The bolt was stiff, but yielded to force. He pulled the door open and held the lamp high. Beyond was a narrow passage, rough-hewn from rock, leading deeper into the earth. The air that flowed from it was colder than the main chamber, carrying a mineral smell that suggested greater depth. Silas hesitated. Common sense said to close the door and leave, but the same compulsion that had driven him to open the original hatch now pushed him forward. He had to know what else was hidden here. The passage descended steeply, the walls close enough to touch on both sides. Water had seeped through in places, creating formations of flowstone that glittered in the lamplight. Silas counted his steps. 100, 200, trying to gauge how deep he was going. The passage turned sharply, then opened into a second chamber, smaller than the first, but no less carefully constructed. What he found there made his blood run cold. The chamber was a workshop, but not for any innocent purpose. Wooden crates lined one wall, stenciled with military markings. Silas pried one open and found explosives. Dynamite, carefully packaged and preserved. Another crate held blasting caps and fuse wire. A third contained something he did not recognize until he read the label, Greek fire mixture, extreme caution. Greek fire. He had read about it in old military texts. An incendiary weapon, nearly impossible to extinguish, used in ancient warfare. Someone in the Iron League had been manufacturing weapons of terror, but it was the desk in the center of the chamber that truly shocked him. On it lay a second journal, different from the one Ezekiel Stone had written. This one was bound in black leather, and the handwriting was different, more angular, less refined. Silas opened it to the first page and read, "Private record of Marcus Stone, Operational Commander, Iron League. This journal contains information too sensitive for general distribution. It is to be destroyed in the event of operational failure." Marcus Stone, the same surname as Ezekiel. A relative, probably. Silas turned the pages, reading with growing horror. Where Ezekiel's journal had been philosophical, almost naive in its revolutionary fervor, Marcus's was coldly practical. It detailed not a coup, but a campaign of terror. The tunnels beneath the capital were not meant for secret access. They were delivery routes for explosives. The plan was to simultaneously detonate charges beneath the governor's mansion, the territorial legislature, and the main armory, decapitating the government in a single coordinated strike. But that was not the worst of it. Marcus's journal revealed that the Iron League had not been a unified organization. There had been two factions. Ezekiel led the idealists, men who believed they could force political change through the threat of violence. Marcus led the pragmatists, who believed only in violence itself. The final entries in the journal told the story of betrayal. Ezekiel had discovered Marcus's true plans. Not just a coup, but mass murder, the killing of civilians along with government officials. He had threatened to expose the entire conspiracy rather than allow such atrocity. Marcus's last entry was dated September 30th, 1843. "My brother has become a liability. He will not see October." Silas closed the journal, his hands shaking. Not rivals, but brothers. Ezekiel and Marcus Stone. One had tried to stop the other, and in doing so had destroyed them both. The confrontation with federal troops that Ezekiel's journal mentioned, had it been coincidence, or had Ezekiel himself informed the authorities to prevent Marcus's plan? And then another thought struck him, more troubling than all the rest. If Marcus had been operational commander, responsible for the practical details of the conspiracy, he would have been the one who knew all the members, all the safe houses, all the caches of weapons and gold. His journal should contain that information. Silas flipped through the pages again, more carefully this time. There, near the end, a detailed list. Gold distribution for operational phase. Main cache, $50,000. Secured in primary bunker. Secondary caches. Location 1, $15,000. Coordinates attached. Location 2, $20,000. Coordinates attached. Location 3, $30,000. Coordinates attached. Total operational funds, $115,000. Silas sat down heavily on a crate, the implications washing over him. The gold in this bunker was not the Iron League's entire fortune. It was less than half. There were 3 other caches, hidden somewhere in the territory, waiting to be found. And if Gardner was investigating old gold coins, he might be aware of these other caches. He might be searching for all of them. The coordinates Marcus had written were cryptic but specific. Location 1 was described as beneath the old mission, Northern Valley. Location 2 was in the wall, 3rd building west of the sawmill, Bannock. Location 3 was simply where the 3 rivers meet under the stone. Silas memorized the descriptions, knowing he should copy them, but also knowing that possessing written evidence of the Iron League's caches would be damning if he was caught. Knowledge in his head could be denied. Knowledge on paper was proof. He returned to the main chamber, his mind reeling. Everything had just become more complicated. The gold was part of a larger conspiracy, one that had involved terrorism and fratricide. The federal government might have been searching for these caches for 30 years. Gardner's appearance could be the first sign that they were close to finding them. And Silas, by selling even a few coins, had revealed that someone had access to at least one cache. He had, without meaning to, announced his discovery to anyone who was watching for exactly that sign. The rational thing would be to abandon the gold entirely, cover his tracks, and hope Gardner lost interest. But rationality had stopped governing Silas's decisions the moment he opened that hatch. Now there were other caches, potentially containing more than double what he had already found. The coordinates were in his memory. The winter would make searching difficult, but not impossible. He climbed out of the bunker and stood in the cold December air, breathing hard. The sun was setting, painting the snow orange and pink. Beautiful and indifferent, like the wilderness itself. The choice before him was stark. Walk away from a fortune because it came with danger, or pursue it despite the risks. Silas had survived 53 years by understanding his limits, by knowing when to push forward and when to retreat. But he had also survived by trusting his instincts, and his instincts told him that Gardner did not know about the other caches. If he had, there would have been more urgency in his questions, more pressure in his approach. Gardner was fishing, hoping Silas would reveal something useful, which meant Silas had an advantage. He knew something Gardner did not. The question was how to exploit that advantage without getting himself killed or imprisoned. As darkness settled over the forest, Silas covered the hatch and began the long walk back to his cabin. Behind him, the bunker and its secrets waited in the earth. Ahead, 3 more caches waited to be found. And somewhere in between, men like Gardner waited to catch anyone foolish enough to disturb the past. Silas had spent his life tracking prey through difficult terrain. Now he was both hunter and hunted, searching for hidden treasure while being searched for in turn. It was a dangerous game, and the stakes had just become higher than he had ever imagined. But he was committed now, for better or worse. The only way forward was through. The old mission was not difficult to find. Silas had been there once, years ago, guiding a historian who wanted to document the territory's early Catholic settlements. It lay in a valley 50 miles northeast of Blackwood, a crumbling adobe structure that had been abandoned for at least 40 years. The mission's priest and his small congregation had moved to more prosperous settlements as the mining camps grew, leaving their chapel to the wind and weather. Silas made the journey in stages, taking 4 days to cover ground that could have been crossed in 2. He was cautious now, watching his back trail, sleeping in cold camps without fires, moving like a man who knew he was being hunted. Whether Gardner was actually following him or merely investigating in parallel, Silas could not be certain. But caution had kept him alive this long. The mission valley was blanketed in snow, the chapel's broken walls rising from the white landscape like dark teeth. Silas circled the area on foot, reading the snow for signs of recent visitors. Nothing. Whatever tracks might have been here were buried under the storm's accumulation. The building itself was empty, home only to birds and the occasional winter-sheltering deer. Beneath the old mission, Marcus Stone's coordinates had been specific. Silas explored the chapel floor, looking for loose stones or obvious disturbances. He found a trapdoor, after 20 minutes of searching, hidden under debris and a rotted rug. The hinges were rusted but functional, and the space below was a root cellar, perhaps 8 feet deep. There, in the northeast corner, was a strongbox identical to the ones in the bunker. Silas descended carefully, his lamp casting wild shadows. The box was locked, but the lock was old and yielded to his knife after some work. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, were gold coins, the $15,000 Marcus had mentioned. Silas sat back, looking at the fortune before him. This cache was smaller than the main bunker, but it was still more money than most men saw in a lifetime. He could take it all. The box was not so large that he could not manage it on horseback. But taking it all meant making multiple trips to assayers, which meant more exposure, more risk. and Gardner's investigation, whatever its scope, would certainly notice a sudden flood of old gold coins entering circulation. Silas made a calculated decision. He took a quarter of the coins, roughly $3,750, and left the rest. If he was lucky, he could convert this amount through 3 or 4 transactions over the next several months without drawing too much attention. And if he was unlucky, if Gardner closed in before he could retrieve the rest, at least he would have something to show for his risks. He reburied the strong box, restored the cellar to its undisturbed appearance, and rode away from the mission as the sun set behind the western peaks. 1 cache down, 2 to go. But the next one would be more difficult. Bannock was a mining town, still relatively active despite the best claims playing out. Third building west of the sawmill would be a structure in town, which meant he could not simply break in at night without risking witnesses. He needed a better plan. The ride back to his cabin took 3 days, and Silas used the time to think. The Bannock cache was $20,000, too much to leave untouched, but it was also in the most dangerous location. He would need to scout the town, identify the building, and find a way to access it without alerting the current occupants, if there were any. Back at his cabin, he hid the gold from the mission cache with the coins he had already taken from the main bunker. His secret compartment was getting crowded. He now possessed roughly $6,000 in old gold coins, a fortune by any measure, but less than 1/10 of what the Iron League had cached. The temptation to pursue the rest was almost overwhelming, but first he needed to know more about Gardner and his investigation. Knowledge was power, his father had always said, and Silas needed power now more than gold. He rode to Millbrook 2 days later, timing his arrival for late afternoon when the general store would be busy. Sarah was behind the counter as usual, and she greeted him with a smile that did not quite reach her eyes. "Silas, good to see you." She glanced around at the other customers, then lowered her voice. "That man Gardner has been asking about you again. Says he's conducting a territorial survey, but Bill doesn't believe him. Bill thinks he's federal. Maybe a marshal or something similar." "What's he been asking?" "Where you go, who you talk to, whether you've come into money recently." Sarah's expression was worried. "Silas, what's going on? Are you in trouble with the government?" "I found some old coins. I sold them. Apparently that's created some interest." Silas kept his voice level. "Nothing illegal about selling coins you find." "There is if they were stolen." Sarah's voice was barely a whisper. "Gardner mentioned something about recovered stolen property. He says there's a territorial claim on certain historical artifacts. I didn't understand all of it, but Silas, he's building a case against someone. I think that someone is you." Silas felt his stomach tighten. Gardner was not just investigating. He was preparing to make an arrest, which meant Silas had less time than he thought. "Did he say when he planned to take action?" "He mentioned getting authorization from the territorial office. That could take weeks, or it could take days." Sarah reached across the counter and gripped his arm. "Whatever you're doing, stop. Whatever you found, leave it alone. It's not worth going to prison. I appreciate your concern. That's not a promise to stop. No, it's not." Sarah released his arm, her expression disappointed but not surprised. "You always were stubborn. Even when we were young, once you made up your mind about something, there was no changing it. Some things don't change." He bought minimal supplies and left town before full dark. Sarah was right about Gardner. He was certain of that. The noose was tightening, but Sarah was wrong about one thing. It was too late to simply stop. He had already committed crimes by taking the gold. Gardner would pursue him regardless of whether he took more. The only difference was how much he would have to show for the risks he had already run. That night, lying in his bed, Silas made his final decision. He would go after the Bannock cache, convert as much gold as he could in the next 2 weeks, and then disappear. The West was vast, and a man with money could vanish into it easily enough. California, perhaps, or the Oregon territories. somewhere far from Montana and Gardner's investigation. But first, he needed to finish what he had started. He rode out 2 days later, heading south toward Bannock. The town was built on a creek that had once yielded significant gold, and although the boom was past, enough miners remained to keep the businesses running. The sawmill was easy to find. It sat on the creek's edge, its water wheels silent in winter. Silas counted buildings westward and identified his target, a 2-story structure that had once been a boarding house, judging by the faded sign. It appeared abandoned now, windows broken and door hanging loose. Silas watched the building for 2 days from various vantage points, learning its rhythms. A few vagrants used it for shelter, coming and going at irregular intervals, but no one seemed to actually live there. More importantly, no one seemed to pay it any particular attention. It was just another decaying structure in a town full of them. On the 3rd night, Silas made his move. He entered through the loose door, moving quietly through the ground floor. Moonlight filtered through broken windows, providing just enough illumination to navigate. In the wall, Marcus's note had said. Silas examined the walls methodically, tapping gently, listening for hollow spaces. He found it in what had been the kitchen, a section of wall that sounded different from the rest. He used his knife to pry loose the boards, revealing a cavity within, and there, wrapped in canvas, was another strong box. $20,000, if Marcus's journal had been accurate. Silas dragged the box into the moonlight and forced the lock. Gold gleamed back at him, row upon row of double eagles. This was the largest single cache yet. Taking it all would be impossible. Taking even half would be dangerous. He needed to be smart about this. He was carefully transferring coins into his saddlebags, calculating how much he could safely carry when he heard the footsteps. Heavy boots on the wooden floor. More than one person, moving purposefully toward him. Silas's hand went to his revolver, but a voice stopped him. "I wouldn't do that, Mr. Vance. We have you surrounded." Lamplight flared in the doorway, and Silas saw 3 men, all armed. In the center stood Thomas Gardner, his expression a mix of satisfaction and something that might have been respect. "I've been waiting for you to lead me to this," Gardner said. "The coins you sold pointed to the main cache, but I knew there would be others. I just needed patience. You did the work for me." He gestured to the strongbox. "Iron League gold, federal property, legally speaking. You've been stealing from the government, Mr. Vance. That's a serious crime." Silas stood slowly, his mind racing through options. He was cornered, outnumbered, and caught literally in the act. But he was not beaten yet. He had spent his life reading terrain and finding ways through impossible situations. This was just another kind of wilderness, another kind of hunt. "3 of you," Silas said calmly. "Close quarters. If shooting starts, at least one of you dies. Maybe 2. Are you willing to take that risk for gold that's been sitting in the dark for 30 years? Gardner smiled. "You're a tracker, Vance. Not a gunfighter. Don't make this worse than it already is." "You're right, I'm a tracker." Silas's hand moved slightly, gauging distances, calculating angles. "I know this territory. I know how to disappear. You might catch me tonight, but you'll have to follow me into country where I have every advantage. Are you prepared for that?" "You're bluffing." "Maybe." Silas met Gardner's eye steadily. "But ask yourself this. Why did I only take part of the gold? Why leave the rest? Because I plan to come back. Because I've been careful. Because I know what I'm doing." Gardner's certainty wavered slightly. "What are you proposing?" "Let me walk out of here. You take the cash, report your success, and let me disappear. You get what you want, the Iron League gold recovered. I get my freedom. Nobody dies in this abandoned building over money that doesn't really belong to anyone." "I can't do that. I have my orders. Orders from men who don't have guns pointed at them in the dark." Silas took a step toward the door. "Think about it, Gardner. Nobody knows you found me here. Nobody knows about this cash except us. You let me go, you're still a hero. You try to arrest me, and we both might end up dead." The standoff hung in the balance, each man measuring the other, calculating odds. And in that moment of calculation, Silas saw his chance. Not to escape entirely, that was impossible now, but to create enough chaos to buy himself a few crucial minutes. That was all he needed. A few minutes of darkness and confusion, and he could vanish into the winter night like smoke. Silas moved in the heartbeat between words and action. His boot kicked out, catching the lamp in Gardner's hand and sending it flying. Glass shattered, oil spread, and flames caught on the dry wooden floor. In the sudden chaos of light and shadow, Silas dove sideways toward the broken window he had noted earlier. Gunfire erupted behind him. 2 shots, 3, wild and panicked in the firelight. He felt the window frame tear at his coat as he crashed through, rolling as he hit the frozen ground outside. More shots followed, splintering wood above his head. He came up running, ignoring the pain in his shoulder where the frame had cut deep. The town was dark, most residents asleep at this late hour. Silas knew the layout from his days of observation. He ran east toward the creek, where willows grew thick along the banks. Behind him, shouts echoed through the night. Gardner's voice, commanding, organizing his men. They would not give up easily. The creek was frozen at its edges, but running in the center. Silas splashed through the shallow water, hoping it would confuse any tracking dogs they might have. The cold was shocking, stealing his breath, but he forced himself to keep moving. Another 20 yards downstream, then up the opposite bank, using willow branches to pull himself up the icy slope. He reached the tree line and paused, listening. The sounds of pursuit were clear, men calling to each other, organizing a search pattern. They were efficient, trained. Gardner had not come alone. He had brought professional help, probably federal marshals. This was not a casual investigation. This was a coordinated operation. Silas began moving through the forest, using every skill his father had taught him. He stepped on rocks and roots where possible, avoiding soft ground that would hold tracks. He broke no branches, disturbed no undergrowth. He became a ghost, moving through the darkness with the silence of long practice. But he was hurt, he realized. The window frame had done more damage than he initially thought. Blood ran warm down his left arm, and his shoulder throbbed with each movement. He needed to stop the bleeding, but stopping meant giving his pursuers time to close the distance. He had to put more ground between them first. The forest here was sparse compared to Blackwood, mostly scrub pine and rocky outcrops. Poor cover, but Silas knew this country well enough. There was a ravine a mile north, steep-sided and difficult to traverse in darkness. If he could reach it before they cut him off, he might have a chance. He ran, his breathing harsh in the cold air, his boots finding purchase on ice-slicked ground through instinct more than sight. Behind him, the sounds of pursuit grew fainter, but he knew that meant nothing. Trained trackers would move quietly, and Gardner had proven himself to be thorough and patient. The man would not give up easily. The ravine appeared suddenly, a black slash in the moonlit landscape. Silas dropped to the ground at its edge, listening. Nothing but wind in the sparse trees and his own ragged breathing. He began working his way along the ravine's edge, looking for a way down that would not leave him exposed against the snow. There, an overhang, creating a small cave-like space, not deep, but enough to hide a man from casual observation. Silas slid into the space, pressing himself against the cold rock, and finally allowed himself to examine his wound. The cut was deep but clean, running from his shoulder down his upper arm. He tore a strip from his shirt and bound it tightly, gritting his teeth against the pain. He would need proper medical attention soon, but first he needed to survive the night. Gardner would expect him to keep running, to put as much distance as possible between himself and Bannock. But Silas had learned long ago that the best place to hide was often close to where you were being hunted. Prey that ran died tired. pray that he'd survived. He settled into the narrow space, controlling his breathing, letting his body still. The cold was dangerous. He knew that. With blood loss and wet clothes, hypothermia was a real threat. But moving was more dangerous. He would wait here until dawn, until he could see the terrain clearly and plan his next move. Hours passed. The moon crossed the sky and shadows shifted. Silas drifted in and out of awareness, fighting to stay alert but losing the battle. Cold, pain, and exhaustion were taking their toll. When he heard the footsteps, he thought at first it was a dream, but no. Someone was moving along the ravine's edge, boots crunching on frozen ground. Silas pressed himself deeper into the overhang, his hand finding the grip of his revolver. If he was discovered, he would not go quietly, but gunfire would draw the others. And then it would be truly over. The footsteps stopped directly above him. Through a gap in the overhang, Silas could see boots, dark against the snow. The person stood motionless, and Silas held his breath, waiting. The person above moved again, and Silas heard a sound that made his heart stop. A woman's voice, soft but clear in the cold air. "Silas Vance, I know you're down there. Don't be foolish. Come out before you freeze to death." Sarah. Impossible, but unmistakable. Silas remained motionless, his mind struggling to make sense of her presence. What was she doing here? How had she found him? "I'm alone," Sarah continued. "Gardner and his men are searching the North Ridge. They think you crossed the creek and kept running. I told them I'd check this ravine, that I knew the country. They believed me because I've lived here longer than they've been alive." Silas considered his options. It could be a trap, Sarah working with Gardner, but that made no sense. She had warned him in Millbrook, had shown concern for his safety, and her voice now held none of the careful neutrality she would have used if marshals were hidden nearby. "I'm coming down," Sarah said. "If you shoot me, at least I'll die knowing I tried." She began descending the ravine wall, moving carefully in the darkness. Silas watched her progress, his revolver still drawn but lowering slightly. She reached the bottom and looked directly at his hiding place, as though she could see through the shadows. "You're hurt. I can smell the blood." Silas emerged slowly. Sarah stood before him, bundled in a heavy coat, carrying a small pack. In the moonlight, her face showed the lines of her years, but her eyes were as sharp as he remembered from their youth. "How did you find me?" "I've known you for 40 years, Silas. I know how you think, how you move. When I heard the commotion in town, heard Gardner mobilizing his men, I knew what had happened. I also knew you wouldn't run straight away. You'd find a place close by and wait them out." She opened her pack and pulled out bandages and a bottle. "Let me see that arm." Silas allowed her to approach, to examine his wound. She worked efficiently, cleaning the cut with liquid that burned like fire, then binding it properly. Her hands were steady, competent. "You need a doctor. I need to not be in federal custody." "That too." She finished securing the bandage and stepped back. "You're a fool, Silas. A brave, stubborn fool, but still a fool." "I won't argue that point. The gold isn't worth this. Prison, possibly hanging if they charge you with serious enough crimes. You should have left it alone." "Maybe, but I didn't." Silas met her eyes. "Why are you helping me?" Sarah was quiet for a moment. "Because I loved you once. Because I still care what happens to you, even though you chose the forest over me. Because you're a good man who made a bad decision, and that doesn't mean you should die for it. Gardner will keep looking. He will, but he doesn't know this territory like we do." Sarah pulled a second coat from her pack and handed it to him. "Bill and I talked it over. We have a plan, if you're willing to trust us." "What kind of plan?" "Gardner is looking for a criminal fleeing with stolen gold. If that criminal were to disappear, if the body of a man matching your description were found at the bottom of this ravine with a broken neck and no gold on him, Gardner would close his investigation. He'd conclude you fell running in the dark, that the gold you took is buried somewhere in the forest, and that finding it isn't worth continuing a manhunt for a dead man. Silas stared at her. You want me to fake my death. I want you to have a chance at life. Not the life you've been living, but a new one. Bill has arranged papers. Passage to California under a different name, letters of introduction to businesses that need experienced guides for their expeditions into the Sierra Nevada. It's not a fortune, but it's honest work and a fresh start. And the body you need to sell this? There's a vagrant who died last night in one of the abandoned buildings. Froze to death. No one knew his name. No one will claim him. Bill has arranged to move him here. It's not pretty, but it's necessary. You and Bill planned all this? He's not the simple banker you always thought he was. He understands that sometimes the law and justice aren't the same thing. Sarah touched his face gently. You have maybe 2 hours before dawn. Gardner's men will be back this way once they realize you didn't cross the North Ridge. You need to decide now. Silas thought of his cabin, his life in the forest, everything he had built over 5 decades. Leaving it meant abandoning not just possessions, but identity itself. Silas Vance would cease to exist, replaced by whoever these forged papers said he was, but staying meant capture, trial, prison, or death while trying to evade it. Sarah was offering him a third option, a kind of death and rebirth. Leave behind the man who had discovered the Iron League's gold and become someone new, someone without that burden. The third cache, Silas said. There's another one. Gardner doesn't know about it. Forget it. You're rich enough already with what you've converted. The rest isn't worth your life. Where the 3 rivers meet under the stone. Silas pulled her close, speaking urgently. If I disappear, if Gardner thinks I'm dead, that gold will sit there forever. I can't take it, but you could. You and Bill. Find it, keep it. Consider it payment for saving my life. Sarah's eyes widened. How much? 30,000, according to the journal. She was quiet for a long moment. You trust us with that information? I trust you with my life. The gold is less important. He smiled, tired but genuine. Besides, you'll need money to pay for that vagrant's silence about how he ended up at the bottom of this ravine. He's already dead. His friends aren't. Someone will need to be paid to forget they saw Bill moving a body. Sarah nodded slowly. All right, we'll find it, and we'll use it well. She squeezed his hand. Now we need to move. Bill is waiting with a wagon 3 miles east. Can you walk that far? I'll manage. They climbed out of the ravine together, moving slowly in the darkness. Behind them, the sounds of Gardner's search party grew louder. Ahead, somewhere in the cold Montana night, waited Bill Brennan with a wagon, forged papers, and a chance at a future Silas had never imagined. 6 months later, a man named Samuel Carson stood on a ridge in the Sierra Nevada, surveying the valley below with the practiced eye of someone who had spent his life reading terrain. The California spring was different from Montana's. Warmer, drier, filled with different birdsong and different trees. But the essential nature of wilderness was the same, and Samuel Carson was a man who understood wilderness. He led expeditions now, guiding wealthy Easterners who wanted to experience the mountains without actually suffering in them. It was good work, profitable work, and it required skills he had spent a lifetime developing. The name was different, the location was different, but the life was not so far from what Silas Vance had known. That brought comfort in a way he had not expected. The physical wound on his arm had healed, leaving a scar that he told people came from a grisly encounter in his younger days. The other wounds, the loss of his identity, the abandonment of everything familiar, those healed more slowly. There were mornings when he woke forgetting who he was supposed to be, reaching for the name Silas before catching himself. But those moments came less frequently as time passed. He had received 2 letters since arriving in California, both forwarded through the careful network Bill Brennan had established. The first had come in February, brief and cryptic. The stone was found, the waters run deep, but the fishing is good. All debts are settled. That meant Sarah and Bill had located the third cache. $30,000, enough to transform their comfortable life into something more. The second letter had arrived just last week, more detailed. Sarah wrote that Gardner had closed his investigation after Silas Vance was found dead at the bottom of a ravine outside Bannock. The body had been properly buried, complete with a simple headstone that read, Silas Vance, 1797 to 1850, lived as he chose. Bill had insisted on that epitaph, Sarah wrote, and she thought Silas would appreciate it. She wrote that they had used part of the gold to expand their general store, bringing in goods that made life better for the community. Another portion they had donated anonymously to fund a school, something the territory desperately needed. The rest they had converted carefully and invested in land, building equity that would sustain them into old age and provide for their grandchildren. We think of you often, Sarah's letter concluded, and we hope you have found peace in your new life. You deserved better than what the past offered. Perhaps California will give you what Montana could not. Samuel, he was learning to think of himself by that name, folded the letter carefully and placed it in his pocket. He would burn it later, as he had burned the first. Even careful letters left trails, and he had become cautious about trails. The expedition he was guiding would set out tomorrow, 6 people from Boston who had paid handsomely for a month-long journey into the high country. They wanted to see eagles and mountain lions, to stand on peaks no white man had summited, to return home with stories that would impress their friends. Samuel would give them all that and keep them safe in the process. It was what he did. It was who he had become. Sometimes, lying in his bedroll under unfamiliar stars, he thought about the Iron League and their failed revolution. Ezekiel Stone had dreamed of changing the world, of building something better than what existed. His brother Marcus had perverted that dream into something dark and violent. In the end, both had died for their convictions, and the world had continued unchanged by their efforts. The gold they had gathered, the weapons they had stockpiled, the elaborate plans they had made, all of it had ended up scattered and forgotten until a tracker stumbled across their legacy 3 decades later. And even then, even with all that wealth suddenly available, the outcome had not been what Silas expected. He had not become rich. He had not transformed his life through gold alone. He had been forced to transform it through sacrifice and help from friends he had not appreciated until the moment he needed them most. There was something in that worth reflecting on. The Iron League had tried to seize power and change history through force. They had failed completely. Silas had tried to seize wealth and change his life through luck and daring. He had succeeded only partially, and only because people who cared about him had been willing to take risks on his behalf. In the end, both stories taught the same lesson. The things we reach for matter less than the people who stand beside us when we reach. Ezekiel Stone had learned that when his brother betrayed him. Silas Vance had learned it when Sarah appeared above his hiding place and offered salvation. Samuel Carson carried those lessons with him now into his new life. He was more careful with trust, but also more appreciative of it when it was given. He was more aware of consequences, but also more willing to accept help when offered. The gold had taught him that wealth without wisdom was just another burden. Tomorrow, he would lead his expedition into the mountains. Next month, there would be another group, and another after that. The work would continue, season by season, building a new life one careful step at a time. It was not the life he had imagined that October morning when he found the iron hatch. It was not the transformation he had dreamed of when he first saw the gold gleaming in lamplight. But it was a good life, honest and productive. He helped people see beauty they would never find on their own. He protected them from dangers they did not understand. He connected them to wilderness in ways that might make them better people. That was worth something. That had value beyond what any amount of gold could measure. The sun set behind the western peaks, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that took his breath away, even after 6 months of California sunsets. Samuel Carson stood and watched until the last light faded, then turned toward his camp and the expedition that waited for tomorrow. Behind him in Montana, a grave marker stood in a cemetery outside Bannock, marking the end of one man's story. Ahead in California, a different story was being written, one day at a time, by someone who had learned that sometimes the greatest treasure is not what we find buried in the earth, but what we discover in ourselves when everything else is stripped away. The forest, whether Montana pine or California oak, remained eternal and indifferent. But the man who walked through it was changed. And in that change, perhaps, was the real gold all along.